if you haven't heard...
Thank you all so much for downloading Revamped Xenoverse 2 throughout all these years. Take care, everyone, and enjoy...
Oh, shit. I mean, oh, shoot. Let's watch something scary while we play something scary.
This story is going to be painful to listen to. It's a horrific tragedy, and there's really no other way to tell it without it coming off that way. And so, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story,
well, I just wanna party with you.
Then you've come to the right place because that's what we do when we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go into the like button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop.
Alright, bro.
Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.
Wait, hold up. Right at the heart. Oh, the leg.
In the early 1960s,
Let me see you disappear real quick.
classmates in South Carolina named Carol and Reggie fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands, they'd laugh with each other, whisper to each other, and then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold, and so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the U.S. Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world.
Oh, yeah.
He would at one point
They're gonna let me
marry,
craft
but that
ammo.
marriage would end quickly. And then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back in his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage.
This place
that
is
nearly
messed
killed
up.
her. On February 18th,
I've gotta get upstairs.
1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter, Rhonda, in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door, and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her several times in the car before turning around and fleeing.
How are you here?
His body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years,
Now
Carol
spend
steadily
like
improved
kings.
and regained some of her independence, but in 1995 she had a
Oh,
huge setback. She
talkies.
started feeling ill, and so she went to
Please
see a
do
doctor,
take a look
and the
at my
doctor
new
did a
stock.
blood test. And they
Damn!
it would turn out
Homie, I see you.
her after the attack that had been transfused into her body to save her life.
Damn!
Did with hepatitis C. She
Damn!
got hepatitis C
I
without
saw you
realizing
eyeing
it.
that.
Hold up.
If it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer.
Let's get some of that. You want some of that? Hey!
She just sat down,
Hold
was
up.
silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, "I just can't get away from this man. He's
Hold
killing
up.
me all over again." But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang, and she answered the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, "Are you
Wait, I can sell my guns, right?
at Garrett High School in South Carolina?" And he said, "Yeah, that's me." And Carol said, "I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school." And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call. And for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids to their relationships they've been in to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years.
That's a
Before they
flashbang.
hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming
Yeah, give me that, give me
A
that.
couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home,
That's crazy,
Rhonda
because
would
I never
say
asked.
it's obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina.
I hope this one
and
makes
move
itself
to Jacksonville, Florida to retire.
Good,
Even
Dave?
though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen, and when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old, and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes, and then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person, and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda, but what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse, and then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple story is all over the news, and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward. But no one came forward, and so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumner's car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville, in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner, and he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing, and that was just totally not true, that in reality they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's Reggie Sumner because, for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old, and so the voice didn't really line up, and just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife Carol?" And he said, "Yep, I'm with her, here she is." And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl, and she too reiterates that everything's just fine, and they've gone out for a couple of days, there's nothing to worry about, and you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply should not be Carol and Reggie. To make sure, they call Rhonda and have her listen to the recording of the conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol, and right away Rhonda says, "That's not my mom, and that's not Reggie." And so at this point, the police assumed that these two people who called in, pretending to be the Sumners, probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements, and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM. And when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds. It was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel, they go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door.
Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Palmer with Third Space Medical in Ridgewood. What if I told you that we can eliminate your neck and low back pain with one simple in-office procedure? Stay tuned to learn more. Excellent choice. Again, my name is Dr. Jeff Palmer with Third Space Medical in Ridgewood, New Jersey. I know nowadays a lot of you are working from home, sitting behind your computer, or even worse, spending most of the time on the couch, binge watching your favorite series. I mean, who doesn't do it? Trust me when I tell you, you are not alone. But this does take a toll on your spine, and it makes havoc within the discs, both in the low back and in your neck. It can cause disc bulging, disc herniations, disc protrusions. It can cause slip discs. It can cause weakness in your core, pain in your neck, radiating pain into your arms and into your legs. Sound familiar? We treat this here in our office with
securing goods is more
spinal
important than
treatment.
anything.
This treatment essentially slowly stretches your spine and helps release nutrients back into the discs, promoting proper healing.
I'm surprised
and
you
advanced
part with this so
pain.
early.
We have an amazing offer for you today, but there's limited availability, so you need to act fast. Click the link below and confirm your appointment for your free consultation.
Oh,
We look forward to helping you change your life. I'll see you soon.
Yeah.
The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers, and video games, and clothes, and perfume, and also they discovered the key to the Sumners' vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all 3 back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these 3 had something to do with the Sumners' disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all 3 of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a 4th person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning, and unlike the other 3, Bruce immediately caved, and the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing, and her father was permanently sick, and so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany. They sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money.
Did he do this
That's
too?
when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville, and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the two of them drive to the Sumners' house in the middle of the night. They haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited. And Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside. I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What do you need?" And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had been going through, and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, "Absolutely no problem, Tiffany. Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want." And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them, and also
Ooh.
Carol and Reggie talked about the sale of their house.
Wouldn't surprise me anymore.
And somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale. And they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early, they made coffee, they made breakfast.
Oh, why'd I do that?
And Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, "Thank you very much, we got to hit the road." And so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're going to come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them. But being as kind and generous as she was, she said, "Hey,
Seems
boys,
useful.
what can I do for you? How can I help you?" And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, "Sure, come on in." And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg. He's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't have much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their
I look forward to seeing the fruits of your
texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, "All clear." And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, you know what, this is awful, we're getting robbed, but after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine, we'll recover. But when these three men finished taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them. And the others had been out 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan, in the Sumners' car, drove up right next to the grave site, while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they'd all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumners' car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and their sweat had caused their respiratory to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these four people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine. Making it really hard to
whatever.
breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart because they're breathing at this point. They did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down until finally they had filled in the hole and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of the shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumner's car and they dumped it in Florida where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumner's money out and then went on a spending spree. Here is a photo of Tiffany celebrating just hours after killing the very people that had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty and given a life sentence. As for Michael, Alan, and Tiffany, they were all sentenced to death. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go into the Like Button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop versions of them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin and link in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Did you know that you and your family may qualify for roofing relief this winter? If you have a roof leak, visible roof deterioration, or potential water damage, you may qualify to get a new metal roof installed as part of a unique roofing relief program, even if you could afford to pay cash for a new roof. But don't wait. Program enrollment is only open for a limited time, and installations are scheduled on a first-served basis. Click the link at the bottom of this video now to see if you qualify for this limited-time program offered by Erie Metal Roofs. It only takes 30 seconds to find out if you qualify.
I wanted to shout hallelujah because I had not moved my knee like that for a year. Hello!
The crime at the center of today's story is considered to be one of the most disturbing of all time.
Piss off.
Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come to the zoo with you, and then once you get there, accidentally spill honey all over them, and then push them into the bear enclosure. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. Austin Harif was born on December 21st, 1996, to a dentist and a pharmacist. They lived in a beautiful home in Palm Beach County, Florida, which is not only one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in Florida, but it is one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in all of America. And that's why, as of 2021, there are 44 billionaires that call this paradise their home. In 2010, when Austin was 16 years old, his parents suddenly divorced.
Off my
Same calendar year, both of his parents had new girlfriends and boyfriends. Now, of course, this was a shock to Austin and his 1-year younger sister, Haley, but they quickly adjusted to their new normal. And that was in large part because the kids didn't move out. They stayed in the family home with their mom, and their father, he did move out, but he moved into a home that was very close by. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and immediately he excelled. He was placed into all advanced classes, and within these advanced classes, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He was about 6 feet tall and weighed about
I knew it. I don't have any.
and for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also
My last shot. This is my last shot.
size and willingness to play these very rough physical sports. Austin was not an aggressive guy. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. And on game days, they would try to make him mad in hopes that would inspire him to go out there and smash some people. But it really didn't work because Austin was Austin. He was just kind of a laid-back guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than smashing them. In fact, towards the end of high school, Austin became obsessed with trying to identify a career that would allow him to help the most people. And he was so passionate about this that when he spoke about it, a huge smile would kind of involuntarily appear on his face. And so because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy disposition, his father very lovingly began referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's graduation in 2015, he received a letter in the mail from Florida State University, and it was informing him he had been accepted into their 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being his intended
I knew
career
it.
path to
I
help
literally
people.
knew it.
And so being accepted
Hi,
into
bro.
this very prestigious program elated.
Yes.
And that summer that followed his high school graduation was
It's
totally
faking that. I
charmed.
know you, bro.
Austin was on cloud nine. He spent a lot of time with his family and his friends. And then finally, at the end of the summer, his family packed all of his stuff into the car. 6 hours from
Securing goods
Tallahassee,
is
where
more
the Florida State
important than
campus was.
anything.
They helped move him into his dorm, and then afterwards they gave him a big hug, said good luck, and they left. And I'm sure on their ride back, the family members thought to themselves, Austin is doing so great. He is not only ready for college,
but
he is
I do
ready
not
to be an
give
adult. He's ready to
discounts.
live on his own and be responsible. And at the end,
Hey,
Austin's
bet.
first
Thank you
year
for
in
your
college,
patronage.
that supposition about him ready to be an adult seemed to be accurate. Austin got excellent grades, he met a nice girlfriend, and even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding, and he had actually built a decent-sized social media presence around bodybuilding and fitness. But underneath all of this public success Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling a lot of the time. He just wasn't telling
No longer
anyone.
need this?
He documented a deep sense of inadequacy caused primarily from his sense that his peers didn't accept him. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy and be more assertive and outgoing, that more people would embrace him and would like him and would accept him. Over the course of that
if
year,
only
Austin
you had
also
the
started
fun.
abusing different substances.
This is all
Those
in
included
it.
things like alcohol,
Till next
marijuana,
week.
and Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a drug that is a stimulant, and it's used to treat people with attention deficit disorder. He also experimented with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms,
Well then,
and he also
feel
tried
free to
MDMA,
peruse.
which is kind of like a cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogenic. And those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible he was taking other drugs too. Regardless, Austin began oscillating between the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on
To think
the
I would
low
buy
of his
such
sober mind, which was totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of the school year, Austin was secretly
Congratulations
poised for a
with-
full-blown mental breakdown.
Till next
and
week.
it seemed like he knew it was coming too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history is filled with questions like, I think I'm crazy, what do I do? And how do you know if you're crazy? And how to deal with obsessive thoughts? And do I need to sleep? And what happens if you don't sleep? It was clear he was starting to question his own sanity. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State that summer, his family immediately noticed there was something wrong with Austin. Within a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his bedroom down into the garage, claiming that the reason he did this was because the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night, never stopping, and every 2 hours he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members and loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt
I
at
was
the
just
time.
thinking of
This
ways
was
to
so
pass the time.
unbelievably weird and totally out of character that they just didn't
I'm
really know
skilled at
what to do.
also
Even
believing
though
so
it was
soon.
obvious there was something wrong, they didn't jump into action. Instead, the only thing they did at first was to just start
Nah, where he at,
their
cut?
bedroom doors at night to
Yeah, I
prevent
like that
Austin
one.
from coming inside during his nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed and Austin continued to act totally weird with no explanation, his family began to become convinced that he must be on drugs, that is what would explain all of this totally strange behavior. And so when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit that he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. He's taking all these drugs. And so naturally, his family latched on to his drug use as being the root cause of his very strange behavior. And so they focused their efforts almost exclusively on getting Austin clean again. But towards the end of the summer, Austin said he wasn't taking any drugs, but Austin was still acting totally crazy and unhinged. And so around mid-August, the family decided they had to utilize something called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals in Florida who are suspected of severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the behest of their loved ones. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed to see what's going on with them. And then at the end of those 72 hours, they are given a treatment plan that is supposed to help them enact. But before the family could utilize the Baker Act, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austin's very close friends, who he had known since second grade,
I want one of y'all get up again. I dare.
calling ahead of time or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. And when when this friend opened the door to see what Austin wanted, Austin just asked him, "What year was I born?" And so the friend says, 1996. And as soon as Austin heard this, he didn't give a reaction to it. He just turned around and he left. And so this longtime friend is looking at Austin walking away, wondering, like, what's going on with this guy? Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? Like, what was that? So the friend goes back inside his house and he's thinking to himself, like, what should I do? And so after a couple of minutes, he decides, you know what, I gotta call Austin and make sure he's okay. So he calls Austin picks up, and it's unclear what they talked about on the phone, but the friend convinced Austin to come back to his house and to just spend the day with him. But really, the friend just wanted to make sure Austin was okay. And so Austin comes back to the friend's house, and then the two of them actually would leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends that were in town that summer, as well as meet up with Austin's sister. And so the group, they decide they're going to go to the beach for the day. On their walk to the beach, Austin tells the group that he just needs to get something at his house, and that he will meet them down at the water.
Against
so at
that
this point,
bitch
the group
Miranda.
believes Austin is just fine, so they say, okay, yep, we'll meet you down there. So Austin breaks off, he goes to his house. When he goes back to the beach, he meets up with his group of friends again. He's changed his outfit. He's now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He's wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches, and he had on sunglasses.
Oh, shoot.
So as he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him. It's super hot out, and they're actually a weird outfit to have on. And immediately they start kind of giving him crap about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. And at first he was quiet, but then he kind of lashed out and said, if you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you. And at this, his friends did not give him any more crap. Everyone just said, okay, man, hey, didn't mean anything by it, just give him a hard time, no big deal. But Austin's like clearly worked up, and so his sister comes over to him and she's like, hey, calm down, it's okay, it's not a big deal. And during this conversation, Austin suddenly goes back to being normal again. And he turns to his sister and says, I'm actually
That's the way of the world.
And I'm immortal. And his
You
sister
should
said,
have never refused me, Ethan.
you really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you, and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help. Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. He said, I agree. There is something going on, and I do need to get help. So after that, Austin and the rest of the group stayed at the beach for several hours, and then in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and Austin's very close friend, who was the guy that saw Austin in the morning when he asked what year was he born, they all said they had to leave. So the trio, they leave the beach, and they head to Duffy's, which was a restaurant in town, and they were going there to meet up with Austin's father's girlfriend. So as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, they're entering this restaurant, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, hey, I need to test out my immortality. And he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, towards traffic, and just starts walking into traffic like he's going to let a car hit him to test his immortality. And so his sister immediately was able to grab him and pulled him back onto the sidewalk, and then basically stood on the left side of him, preventing him from running out into traffic, and kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of his restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk out into traffic, again, and it was there that the trio met up with Austin's father, his girlfriend, and the 5 of them went into Duffy's restaurant. It was about 11:45 p.m. when they got inside, and they were very quickly sat in the very back of the restaurant in this booth. So there was a CCTV camera that watched them while they were inside this building. And so they're sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up and walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom, but then stops, doesn't go to the bathroom, turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then walks out the front doors, just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did. But just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table, except this time, instead of feigning going to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant. She was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. And so she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen, drinking vegetable oil, and there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. And so she runs up to him and she grabs the vegetable oil and she puts it down and she tells him to stop, at which point Austin does stop. And then I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes because perhaps he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. And so she watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door and she drove off. So about 30 minutes after he left that second time, Austin walks through the front doors of the restaurant, he had a different shirt on, different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, his father, and his girlfriend are, and he sits down like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent, but then Austin's father... is wrong with this. Austin just stands up and presses his father's face back up against the seat, kind of pinning him there, and then at some point he just lets go, he leaves the booth, and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third time. Austin's friend who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him, and so by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went, and so he quickly came back in the restaurant. He told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was, and so at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they didn't know where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself or someone else, and so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go on. About 4 miles away from this restaurant, 53-year-old Michelle Mishkon was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 59-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog, so for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years. Together from previous marriages, and they were just totally in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. That was basically like their living room. They loved having the door wide open so they could wave to neighbors and flag people down to have a drink with them or just chat
You
with
need to pull
them.
a cig out of your butt.
Happy, loving couple that were fun to be around.
Nah, not with that hand.
Kids, they had both recently retired.
No, thank you.
John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her financial advisory job, and the two of them were apparently both just
I'm
really
buying
excited
this because of
about
our
retirement life.
relationship.
They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go
cool.
out fishing on their boat with their dog, and then also spend as much time as they could
M1851.
John and Michelle's neighbor across the
M1851.
street
A good
was a
deal.
middle-aged man named Jeff Bishop.
M1851.
He was really
Ways
close
to
with the
pass the
couple. He would
time.
usually watch their dogs anytime they went away, and he would often go in their garage, a drink, and just kind of hang out with them. And so this particular night, he was over in his house, and he was going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep.
What?
Some strange sounds coming from outside his window across the street over near John and Michelle's property. And so Jeff sits up in his bed and kind of
Thank you
strains
for
his
your
ears
patronage.
to see what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears
Patronage.
a curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. And so Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door, and he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway, and he begins walking up the driveway, and at the top of the driveway, Jeff sees Michelle is standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified, and she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Harrow. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was he heard this scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look good. And so instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle. But before he could even get across the street, he's looking up. And now he's on top of her and he's beating her. And so Jeff runs onto the driveway, and as he's going right up the driveway between the two cars parked there, Austin leaps.
No, that was close. I don't have any more ammo. You thought, get off my back. Don't come near me again.
Continue pummeling poor Michelle, and he had no idea where John was, and so he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin. Austin, and as he did that, Austin swung and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit, he didn't fall down, he grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground. And Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. And so Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up. But as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin stand,
shut up.
Suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, in his neck, on his back.
Come on.
He looks down and he sees blood all over his arms. It's everywhere. He's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he punched Jeff, that knife went into his face and cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points in that one swing. And so Jeff believed at the time this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up,
Expanded my service. Please, come take a look.
Chance is for him to run and call the police.
I do.
Runs into Michelle's property, thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him.
A new
Pionio. Back door, and then he loops around the property, and then he makes a run for it straight across the street to his house. Never once did he turn around to see if this guy was after him.
How does that? It's the same thing as before.
He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911.
I'm gonna try and talk some more. Let's have a...
Beating up a woman across the street.
Are either of them injured? Can you tell from where you are?
Yes, there's a girl.
Got a long way to go.
He beat her up. I ran over there. I'm bleeding profusely here at the moment.
Okay.
I don't know what happened.
Can you tell if she's conscious?
No, it does not appear so, no. I've been stabbed in the back. I'm bleeding pretty bad.
After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious, but all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac, Austin, has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or, I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person, if it's two, if it's male, if it's female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds. Seconds later, the following narrative is the account of the second responder, we'll just call Dan, and the first responding
I don't give a shit about your family drama.
And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway, her gun is out, she's getting ready to engage.
Please give me something to craft, bro.
Dan, he hops out of his car, he's got his hand on his gun, and as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are 2 cars parked in the driveway, and so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot stream of blood just coming down the driveway. So he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up, and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground right in front of the car, so he can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side, right behind Kristen, and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at, and he sees there's this man lying on the ground, his eyes are open, he's just laying there very stiff. He's looking up at Kristen, looking up at Dan, and he's just quietly saying, please help me. The man on the ground was John Stevens, and on top of was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around his neck to kind of hold him in place, and then he had his right arm and he was doing something to John's face. But Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was there was clearly an aggressor and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin into John, killing John. And so Dan tells Kristen, hold on, I'm going to tase him. And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser, and right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face. With his free right hand, he was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fish hook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. And so Dan kind of snapped
Another
out of
one?
what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin, but it did nothing.
They got jetpacks, my dude.
Austin was entirely focused on fighting John's face. That's all he was doing. He wasn't even registering.
Yo, they're cornering me, bro.
And so Dan runs back to the side of her. He's now on her right side. So he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. He tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin comes off
Damn it.
of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deep
Come
grip
on here, bro.
on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back.
I got so lucky with that.
Unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip, he goes back and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again, right as another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine, they had a dog. And so they come flying up, they kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, release the dog. And so sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fish hooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin
You gotta stop it somehow.
ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back on Austin's arm, and it pulled it off of John's body, and so his arm is back like this again, and Austin, again, unfazed, just yanks his arm out of the dog's teeth, again, shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm, and this time when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back, and he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back, and he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do, and so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him the whole time. Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. Ultimately, John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack and was unharmed, and it was given to one of their children to
that
take
was
care
close.
of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was laying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage. That was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested, but the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's drug abuse history, that he must have been on some drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs, which are very powerful and And at the time, they were quite popular in Florida, and they'd caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana, and then the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital.
I'd like to see you try.
At the time of this attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember, I don't know," but eventually he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time after he fought with his father and stormed
There's
out,
more?
after that he saw this dark figure outside face, and he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. So he ran about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there. He said he saw this brightly lit up garage, and he ran up into it, believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house, and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog, and Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him, but he probably came off looking completely insane, and Michelle screamed, at which point Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch, and so he pulled out his knife and attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning, but we don't know for sure, and frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with, because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher, he has no recollection of John or what he looked like, and he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face, and he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank, and then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin, and he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 38-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence of drugs, will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there's threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was suffering from on the night of the attack is something called clinical lycanthropy. Clinical lycanthropy is a occurrence where an individual believes they are no longer human, and almost always what they believe they are is something akin to a werewolf. And in Austin's case, it's not that hard to figure out why you might reach that type of conclusion. He had told his sister that he believed he was half horse, and then on a couple other occasions, he had told his other friends that he believed he was half dog. And then, of course, on the night of the attack, after he killed Michelle, he pounced literally on John and began eating his face while making those loud, animalistic grunting sounds. This is behavior that is certainly on par with what you would expect a werewolf to do in a movie. But this was not a movie, this was real life. After Austin came out of his coma, but before he had been transferred to jail, he agreed to do an interview with the clinical psychologist, TV personality Phil McGraw, better known as Dr. Phil. And during their 10-minute Zoom interview, Austin would break down and cry and say he was incredibly sorry of the victims, that he didn't really know why it happened, and that clearly there was something wrong with him and he needed help, and he just hoped they could find it in their hearts to eventually forgive him. But it's unlikely the family of the victims are going to forgive him anytime soon, especially when you consider they came out in an interview and said, I hope Austin makes a full recovery from his coma, and he's no brain damage, and he's totally A-okay, so he can be fully aware and lucid when they read him his sentence. A sentence they hoped. Victims will just have to keep on waiting because Austin is still in jail awaiting trial. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to help with you.
Really? He knows.
Push them into the bear enclosure. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and mugs and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballin.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions,
damn, there's two of them. If you want to get
in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. The username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin6. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok. My username is Mr. Ballin. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballin, where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination,
you suck.
I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See you.
I'm gonna need that grenade launcher back, bro.
If you could cancel on streaming services, but still watch all your favorite channels, would you do it?
Yo, my dude. God damn.
Hardest to make it illegal in the U.S. Rather than
Of the hundreds of stories I have covered on this channel, today's story is going to easily rank in the top 5 most distressing I have ever covered. Now, there is not any graphic footage or at the end of this story, and so for that reason,
I'm buying this because of our relationship, you know. Securing goods is more important than anything. I look forward to seeing the fruits of your exploration.
You really are a tough one. But I'm tired of chit-chat. Time to die. You can hear it, can't you? Someone waiting for you.
Now stay down.
And she just loved the idea of getting to be motherly again and the idea of getting to hold this precious little baby. And so even though Tom and Jackie were absolutely loving living out on this yacht, they decided that the time was right to actually sell the yacht and then take the proceeds from the sale of the yacht and buy a house on land to be closer to their son and this grandbaby. So in November of that year,
oh shoot,
had in this fishing magazine for the sale of their yacht, they were asking about $500,000. And very quickly after this ad went live, this young couple who had saved up some cash, they offered to buy it. Tom and Jackie were totally thrilled, and they called their two sons to tell them the good news that they had this buyer, and then in the next couple of days, the sale would be finalized, and then they would be in touch. And so the sons, they're expecting to get a phone call from Tom and Jackie any day, but a couple of days goes by, and they haven't heard from them. And so the sons begin calling their parents, and their parents are not picking up their phone. Now, Tom and Jackie,
what?
the type to go any of them.
Hello? Hello?
1 second. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Hey. What did she say? Huh? What did she say? Don't act stupid. Tell me what she said. And forget that she's looking at you and everybody's looking at you.
Oh.
What did your mother say? Huh? Do you know or you don't know? Because two people told you the same thing. Calm down.
Got you.
Time